All right, today's speaker is Chris Evans. Chris is the Forestry Extension and Research Specialist for Illinois Extension, and he's based at Dixon Springs Ag Center. Welcome, Chris. I will turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Aaron. I'm really happy to be here with you all today talking about this topic. And when we were discussing kind of the Everyday Environment webinar series, and I wanted to do one of the webinars, we really wanted to make it as, applicable as possible and applied in terms of, actionable information. And so we went with this idea of let's figure out what you should and shouldn't do in terms of invasive species in the spring. And so this is a big topic. I'm certainly not going to be able I'm not going to have a chance to cover everything, but I do hope that we can cover some good information and then take some questions as well. Hope to leave plenty of time. And so what I'm trying to do really again is explore these management activities and what you can do and what's really best suited in the spring, right? And then what are some other things that you probably shouldn't do or you should wait till a later part or later season or something like that. And so I'm going to cover really 4 topics today. So I'm going to cover garlic mustard, Japanese stiltgrass, invasive shrubs and trees kind of as a big group, and then end with just what you should do in terms of dealing with your management tools and equipment. And so some of the stuff I'm going to talk about can be really applicable to other species as well, but this is kind of how I got it laid out. So let's just jump right in and start with garlic mustard. So most of you, I'm sure, are pretty familiar with garlic mustard. It's been around for a long time in Illinois, a real problematic invader in our forest, kind of widely distributed across the state. But if you're unfamiliar with it, the relevance to the spring are that it's a biennial plant, which of course biennial means it has a 2-year life cycle. And then it's going to die at that point after that second year and only really kind of persist through seed production. And it also has very early spring growth. And so it comes up, it's one of the first things to bloom in the spring, and it kind of finishes its life cycle pretty early in the year. And so just looking at the life stages of garlic mustard, you can see here the first year plants. They are these basal rosettes, which are just little clumps of leaves. They'll stick around for a year like that and even kind of be green throughout the winter often. And then they start getting more robust. They start into this bolting stage, so they'll get a lot more leaves on them and then eventually start sending up a flowering stalk. And this happens early spring, and then it'll have a period when it's actively flowering and then producing fruit, and then the fruit will dry up and the seeds will release after that. And so this all happens in the spring, and you can actually have kind of multiple stages of this phenology at the same time, right? So you can have new flowers, like on the left, you can have flowers and fruit together, or mostly fruit and on different plants. But then kind of late spring, you see garlic mustard with these well-developed fruits and then eventually drying down, opening the fruits and releasing those seeds. So when you're managing garlic mustard in the spring, your main goal is to prevent that formation of viable seeds. So again, this is a biennial plant. So biennials and annual plants, they only persist through seed formation, right? Their populations of individuals do not persist beyond that 1 year for annual or 2 years for biennials. The population has to persist through active seed formation and replenishing that seed bank. And so your goal of managing this is to try to stop that. So garlic mustard being a plant that primarily finishes its life cycle in that second year during the spring, produces those fruit, and then kind of finishes things up. You need to focus your activities on the spring, because if you wait too long, you're gonna miss your opportunity. The other thing you want to do in the spring basically is take steps to prevent new infestations. You don't want to accidentally move this plant around and spread the seeds. So some of the actions that you can do in the springtime for garlic mustard, one would be a mechanical hand pulling. We've all seen these, volunteer days out there and kind of taking part in them. But garlic mustard is a fairly easy plant to pull in the spring. If you're working on your own land and you don't have much of it, they're pretty easy to pull them up. In general, if the plants are starting to flower, or especially if they have green fruit, you would want, as you pull those plants up, you'd want to bag them to get rid of them and take them away from the forest. I generally recommend, black plastic bags. When you fill them up, you tie them tight and then leave them in the sun for a few days to hopefully build up that internal temperature to kill the seeds in that before you discard them. If you wait a little too late and the plants are drying down and those seeds are starting to actively drop as the fruit are opening up, it's probably not worth it to pull it at that time, because probably what you're going to do is more just spread those seeds around, right? So you want to do that activity, hand pulling, before those fruit are dry on the plants. Now, another spring management action you can do for garlic mustard would be herbicide treatments. And so we found that foliar treatment, so spraying the foliage of garlic mustard with either a triclopyr or a glyphosate-based herbicide, so that would be things like Garlon, Crossbow for triclopyr, or Roundup, or something like that for glyphosate. These are highly effective at controlling garlic mustard when you use it on them as a foliar spray. You can treat them in the rosette or the bolting stage. And again, very highly effective. But you see a lot of reports out there about once the plant starts flowering, or especially once flowering is kind of be up post, you shouldn't use that. All right, so we actually did some research recently to look at this and to see what about if you try to use herbicide in this flowering and post-flowering period for garlic mustard. So I'll just hit a little bit of our research on this, and we looked at the systemic herbicides and we sprayed them on garlic mustard when the seeds were already present. So the green fruit was present on the plant. They were fully developed and flowering. It kind of already stopped at that point for garlic mustard, and we sprayed herbicide at that time. That is way later than is typically recommended for controlling garlic mustard, but we wanted to see what would happen. And so our goal with that was to kind of expand, or at least better understand, our options for controlling garlic mustard in the spring. What is our true window of being able to use herbicides in the spring? And the reason we did this is that you can always hand pull them at that time, but hand pulling is a little slower. It may disturb the soil more so than herbicide. And so we just wanted to see kind of how long we could have herbicide as one of our tools in our toolbox for controlling garlic mustard in the spring. And so we partnered with the University of Wisconsin on this. We set up some plots and measured this in kind of heavy infestations. We did this at 3 locations throughout the Midwest, and we treated them both with glyphosate and triclopyr as kind of the normal recommended rates, as well as we set plots up and we did not treat them. We just did an untreated control to see what would happen. And so we did this we sprayed them when the green fruit was already developed, and then the petals on those plants were actively falling off. It was kind of right at the end of flowering in the spring. And so for Southern Illinois, that was May 7th. And this is way back in 2018. And then in Wisconsin, Southern Wisconsin, we had 2 sites, and that was towards the end of May. But this is a shot here of the sites in Illinois, and you can see this is about a week before we actually sprayed the plants. And you can see here there was a few flowers still left on the top of the plants, but most of the fruit have already formed. And then we waited about a week later than this to spray them. Again, looking at what would happen to the seeds, we knew the seeds were already produced. We wanted to find out, would they be viable? And so here is one plot that we sprayed with triclopyr, and this is 2 weeks after we sprayed it. You can see that the plants are certainly starting to wilt, but there's still a lot of fruit on this plant, and the fruit's well formed, right? Large fruit with definitely seeds. About 6 weeks after treatment, it was certainly dried down, and we found that glyphosate worked a lot faster, and only 2 weeks after treatment, it was already brown. But again, they had seeds on them even before we sprayed them. So what we did was take some plants from each plot, we dried those plants, take the seeds out, we collected the seeds and weighed them, and then tested them for viability. And so what we found was that it was actually highly effective at reducing viable seed production. Even though seed production was high on these plants, the vast majority of them were not viable. And so you see here in one of our Wisconsin sites, we reduced viable seed by 70 to 84%. Another Wisconsin site, it was reduced by 86 to 98%. And then in Illinois, the viable seed was reduced by over 99%. So we found out that this is actually an effective treatment. While it doesn't completely eliminate seeds, if you still have garlic mustard you're dealing with and it's that late in the season when it starts flowering and it starts producing fruit, you still can use herbicide as a treatment and reduce that seed production quite a bit, right? And so I think it can still be used at that time, even though I wouldn't wait until that time, obviously, and use this as kind of your primary method of control. So in terms of garlic mustard, and then what to do and what not to do. So in the springtime, you can do these early season herbicide treatments of rosettes, bolting second year plants. You can hand pull bolting and flowering second year plants. If they're flowering, the recommendation is to bag the plants to see, just to keep them from actually continuing to produce viable seed. We're actually currently testing that this year to see if you pull garlic mustard when it's flowering, what are the actual results, and will they actually continue to develop and produce viable seed or not? So we're working on that, kind of verifying that question. And then also what you can do with garlic mustard is for flowering and immediately post-flowering plants, you can do herbicide treatments, and it seems as long as the fruit are still green, it can be very effective at reducing that seed set. Again, not the primary strategy, but it will reduce seed production significantly. So there's a lot of options of what you can do with garlic mustard. What you shouldn't do for garlic mustard would be mowing, weed whipping, or other type of mechanical damage when the seeds are already produced on the plant. That is not going to be an effective method at controlling this plant. Again, once those seeds are produced and on that plant's going to die anyway, right? You should halt any activities in infested sites when those fruit are dry and dropping seeds. So that would be hand pulling, mowing, anything like that, even kind of walking and actively moving through those sites. Just because the seeds are very easy to get picked up, in the cuffs of your shoe or of your pants, or stuck in your shoes, or stuck in mud. And so anytime that those seeds are actively dropping, just try not to work or move or be in areas that have infestations of garlic mustard. Otherwise, you're just going to contribute to its spread. And then also what not to do is herbicide treatments when the fruit are already starting to dry. If you see them starting to lose that green color and yellowing, at that point in time, that the seeds are starting to kind of harden off in that fruit, and they're not going to be susceptible to herbicide treatments. And so, at that point in time, you've kind of missed your window for the year. Garlic mustard's an interesting one where there has been some recent research that has shown that there's some populations that have declined a little bit over time. If they've been there for a while, they may self-limit a little bit. And so there's a really good guide out there that the Midwest Invasive Plant Network has put out that's basically a decision tree for managers or folks wanting to control garlic mustard in terms of when to management, what should you do. And so this is a free publication that is on the Midwest Invasive Plant Network's website. I'd highly recommend looking at it just for kind of that discussion and again, decision tree on managing garlic mustard in the spring. So it's a very great resource. All right. So moving on to our second category, Japanese stiltgrass. And so this is one that maybe not all of you are that familiar with. Stiltgrass is a species that is really, really widespread in the southern third to southern half of the state. It's really one of our biggest invasive plant issues that we have in our forest. But it's actively spreading throughout the rest of the state. There's multiple counties in the northern half of the state that have stiltgrass, that even all the way into Wisconsin, Iowa has problems with it now. So even if you're not dealing with it currently, unfortunately, you may be dealing with this plant in the future if you live in the northern half of the state. If you're in the southern half of the state, you likely are already dealing with this one. In terms of its ecology and the relevance to dealing with stiltgrass in the spring, this is an annual warm season grass. It tends to germinate mid to late spring, actually, and conducts most of its growth in the summer, and then flowers and set seeds in the fall. So in the springtime, there's not a lot of active growth, but it does give us some windows of what we can and can't do with it. And then just looking a little bit about its phenology, early spring and winter, you're going to see this, heavy thatch on the ground, easily identifiable, so you can pick it out even at this time just by the thatch. And then you get early germination in Southern Illinois. This is probably late March. If you farther get into Northern Illinois, you're probably looking at early April. And this early germination, then grows into young seedlings, and it'll kind of languish a little bit for a while in the spring at this kind of, early stage, and then really starts putting most of its growth on mid-season when the temperatures get warm, and late season as it really puts on a lot of biomass before flowering. And then this plant often doesn't flower until September or even later. And so it flowers and then sets seeds and then dies. This is an annual, so it's got this 1 year life cycle. And so our priorities in spring are very similar to what we said in garlic mustard, in the sense that since this is an annual and garlic mustard's a biennial, both of their populations only persist through seed formation. So our goal with stiltgrass in any kind of management is to try to prevent that formation of viable seed for that year, as well as trying to prevent new infestations through accidentally moving the seed around, right? So there's a few things you can do in the springtime to deal with stiltgrass. One thing is there are treatments, right? As those germinates come up, you could weed whip them, you could pull them, torch them, even do foliar treatments on them. In general, that's not super effective in early springtime or even mid-spring. And the reason why is they're very small at that point in time. You don't get a lot of herbicide on them. They're hard to catch everything with weed whips, and you certainly can't pull them. There's not very feasible to pull them when they're that small. And stiltgrass tends to have somewhat of a long germination window, which means even if you control every stiltgrass plant out there in very early spring, it's likely to germinate after that and have a subsequent germination and continue to grow. So anytime you do any kind of these management activities where you're controlling existing plants on the ground in the spring, you're going to have to follow up later in that season. Otherwise, it's not going to be effective, right? If you control everything in the spring and you come back a few weeks later, you're going to have another blanket of seedlings in there, right? So follow-up treatments are very necessary. In general, when we're controlling existing plants, post-emerging plants, we often wait later in that season, so that way we control everything that's there and there's not enough time for subsequent germination and growth of those plants. But even with that being said, there are things you can do in the spring. And so this goes to some more research that we recently did. When we looked at, instead of controlling the plants with a post-emergent herbicide, which you actually spray on the plant, we wanted to look at using pre-emergent herbicides. And so these are herbicides that you apply to the soil, and they work on seeds as the seeds are germinating and starting to grow. They kind of control germinating seeds at that point, right? And so we wanted to know, could you use a pre-emergent herbicide in heavy infestations of stiltgrass to give you kind of season-long control? So we wanted to look at this just as an option again for these really heavily invaded areas. And so we did this by putting in some plots in a really heavy stiltgrass infestation in southern Illinois. We applied the different types of pre-emergent herbicides in early spring, right before germination, and then we followed them throughout a whole year. Again, these are plants that have this 1 year life cycle. So we estimated percent cover for stiltgrass as well as native vegetation 1, 2, 4, and 6 months after treatment. And so 6 months is kind of would be the end of that growing season for stiltgrass, just to see what this herbicide would do. And so we looked at a bunch of different pre-emergent herbicides at a bunch of different rates, as well as we had an untreated control out there where we just followed the stiltgrass as it was growing. And so you can see here us treating, you can see all the thatch on the ground. So, this was a heavy infestation of stiltgrass. We treated it really early in the spring. This was mid-March, I think, and followed it throughout that season. And so this is mid-season, and you can see our squares, our rectangles there where we've treated the stiltgrass growing, and then everywhere else is just heavy stiltgrass. Another shot here, you can really see one of our plots with just a ton of stiltgrass growing around it, just to kind of show you what we were doing. And so if you look at the data, it's actually really interesting. And so this is on the left is untreated, and of course the bars are 1, 2, 4, and 6 months after treatment. And you can see there that when we did not treat the stiltgrass, within a month it went up to over 80% cover of our plots, and then jumped up to around 90% cover and stayed there. So really heavily infested. And then all of our treatments worked really effectively early. So you can see that 1 month after treatment, every option we tested was below 10%, but there was several of them. The Esplanade treatments and the Prowl treatments for different pre-emergent herbicides that did not give us very long control. And again, it was that long germination window of stiltgrass that got us where it didn't last that long in the soil, and stiltgrass was able to regrow afterwards. And by the end of the season, all of those were already over 50% stiltgrass. So we had significant stiltgrass regrowth with those, but there was others. Well, the ones that had Esplanade Shore or Oust in them, it gave us season-long control, right? So they stayed below 10% stiltgrass the entire season. And if you looked at what happened to the native species, so the native species vegetation was able to kind of rebound a little bit in those. In the untreated, it was down below 10%. The ones with Oust in it, it was pretty low too. But in a couple of the plots there, we saw that a rebounding of that native vegetation, at least up to 18, 20%, which is not bad for the first year of controlling. One thing we noticed was the Oust herbicide tended to move in the soil, and we did not like that in a natural setting. So you can see here that the water kind of ran it down. We had these little trails of controlled areas outside of our plots, and so we didn't like the movement through overland flow of water with that. And so, and we didn't get a lot of regrowth of even native species when we used Oust. So we found that pre-emergent was very effective, particularly Esplanade Shore was the one that we thought was really effective at controlling stiltgrass if you want to spray it in the spring in these heavy infestations. A couple of the other pre-emergents were less effective, so you either need to do a subsequent retreatment middle in the season or use one of these other herbicides in there. So it's a tool for your toolbox, certainly for controlling stiltgrass in the spring. So in terms of what to do and what not to do with stiltgrass in the spring, what to do would be early season applications of pre-emergent herbicide, particularly that Esplanade Shore worked really well in heavily infested areas. And if you're a little late and their seedlings are already being produced, you can tank mix some glyphosate with that pre-emergent, and then you can control some of those little seedlings and give yourself a little pre-emergent control at the same time. The other thing you can do is that thatch that you see, the winter thatch or those germinating seedlings are highly visible at that time of year. And so it's really easy to survey and look for stiltgrass in the early season in early spring, and that'll allow you then to come back later and then control it in the middle of the season if you want to use a different technique other than pre-emergent herbicide. So it's a great time to get out there and find patches of stiltgrass. What not to do with stiltgrass in the spring would be to apply post-emergent herbicide treatment. So foliar sprays on the existing plants. Applying them in the early spring, if you don't plan to do any follow-up treatment, is not going to be effective. You're going to get subsequent germination and regrowth. It's a strong possibility. So don't just apply your herbicide in the spring and that's it. Also, the wet soil conditions in spring really makes it easy to move stiltgrass around. So be careful to not spread stiltgrass seeds in mud and dirt on your shoes or in equipment by driving around in infested areas in wet soil conditions. All right, moving on to our third category would be invasive shrubs and trees. Now there's a bunch of species in this category, so I just kind of lumped them together because a lot of the recommendations are similar. Many of these species have an extended leaf phenology, which means that in the springtime, they're going to green up quite a bit earlier than most of our native woody species. And then some of these species have very early flowering, which makes them very identifiable in the spring as well. And so within this group, there's things like bush honeysuckle, very early leaf phenology, autumn olive, same way. Privet, which is a growing problem throughout the state, really particularly in central Illinois. We're seeing lots of privet on the landscape nowadays, invading our forest. And then Callery pear, which doesn't have as much of a early leaf phenology as it has early flowering that makes it highly visible. There's a lot of other invasive woody plants out there that are problems, but they don't have as much of an early phenology as the ones I mentioned. You can say, barberry and burning bush and buckthorn. There's a lot of different ones out there. And so with these woody plants, your spring management priorities, would be controlling these plants, though either by removing their root system through mechanical control or somehow rendering it incapable of sprouting, right? So most of these woody invasive plants are aggressive sprouters when damaged. So you want to try to keep that actual plant down from sprouting, kill that actual plant, the root system of that plant. And then also another spring management activity would take advantage of the stage in springtime when they're highly visible. Either they're growing early and they're the only thing that's green in the woods, or they're at a highly visible stage like the flowering Callery pear, and take advantage of that to find new locations or survey your land for these woody invasive plants in springtime. It's really an easy time to get out there and map a lot of these invasives. So there's different things you can do in the spring, right? So there's mechanical removal. And so you could hand pull small or shallow rooted individuals or use pulling aids to assist with larger individuals. And so pulling aids would be weed wrenches or puller bears or some of these tools that give you a mechanical advantage and give you some leverage to grab the invasive shrubs and pull them out of the ground. Usually you're going to be limited to things that are probably 1.5 to 2 inches in diameter at the base or smaller. But these all can be very effective, particularly in moist soil conditions of mechanically pulling out these invasive shrubs. There's some positive for them, right? So they're good for volunteers to use mechanical pulling aids. There's really no training or licensing or anything necessary. They work on many woody species, particularly smaller diameter stems, like I said, 1.5 or smaller typically. Shallow rooted species like the honeysuckles work really well on. And they work in a lot of situations. Loose, uncompacted soils, when you have soil moisture, they're very effective. The negatives of using these mechanical pulling aids is they're heavy, so they can cause fatigue over time for sure. And they don't work in some situations, right? Larger diameter species, deep-rooted species, something like autumn olive, they work a little less effective on. And then when you have dry and compacted soils, they're not going to work as easy. You're going to tend to break those plants off. And they do promote a little soil disturbance, but they certainly have their place, and that's an option for spring management of these species. In terms of chemical control of invasive shrubs in the springtime, Foliar treatment, so spraying the foliage of the plant or doing a cut stump treatment, those tend to be much less effective in early spring during that period when the buds are starting to break in very early spring, all the way to the point when that leaf expansion is still active and going and it's not yet full. During that period of early spring, kind of we call it the spring green up, foliar treatments and cut stump treatments tend to be much less effective at controlling woody invasive plants. However, basal bark treatments, which is where you're spraying the actual bark of that plant and letting the herbicide penetrate through, can be very effective at that time, particularly on thin bark species. So just covering a couple of those. So this kind of spot spray foliar treatments where you're spraying the leaves of the plants, that's where we're talking about basically putting a dilute solution of herbicide onto the leaves, and then getting good coverage over the plant and killing those, right? So that's a foliar spray. Cut stump treatments is where you're basically controlling the plant by cutting it off close to the ground, putting a concentrated herbicide right on that stump to allow it to penetrate in there and move into the roots and kill that plant that way. When you're using cut stump, you're looking at chainsaws or hand saws or clearing saws or loppers or anything like that, and then a spray bottle, some kind of spray bottle. Again, both of these, foliar spray and cut stump, are not that effective from the time when those plants, those buds start swelling in the early spring as the plant starts to grow, all the way through the point that that plant is kind of done with its first flush of growth and growing and elongating the new shoots and putting the leaves out. That period of time in the early spring, don't use foliar spray and cut stump. They are less effective. However, I think what some people have taken that cautionary statement to mean is that don't do anything with these in the spring. That cut, stump, and foliar are not effective at any time in the spring, and that's not the case. It's just during that period. I went out a week and a half ago to look at these plants, and so this is April 1st in far southern Illinois, and this is autumn olive, and you can see autumn olive was already flowering. The leaves were already at or very near their full size, and then kind of that initial flush of growth was already finished. So at that point in time this year, by April 1st already, you can go ahead and use cut stump or foliar spray on autumn olive or on bush honeysuckle. You can see here, bush honeysuckle leaf expansion was complete. We're actually already getting flower buds starting on the honeysuckle by April 1st. So at this year, April 1st already and later, you could have used foliar spray and cut stump and been very effective. Before that, so anywhere from probably the middle of February through all of March or most of March, that's that period this year that would have been ineffective. It's hard to set a date that sticks year to year because there's a lot of variation. What you'll need to do is evaluate the plants to see if they're at this point in this stage, like in these pictures, or not. If they're not at those stages yet and they're still kind of earlier in the development, you would want to wait a little bit to do a foliar or cut stump treatment. But if they're already full leaf expansion, flowering, or flower buds like we see in these pictures, then you can go ahead and start using that cut stump or that foliar, their treatments at that point. And as I mentioned earlier, this basal bark treatment works pretty much throughout the year. You're basically spraying an oil-based herbicide, an ester herbicide all along the bark from about ground to 12 to 14 inches high, and let it penetrate through the bark. It works really well on these thin bark species like autumn olive, and you can do that pretty much any time of the year, even during spring green up. The researchers found that it's effective then. And you're using things like, backpack sprayers in there, or these kind of hand pressurized sprayers to do that. Kind of other activities you can do in the spring on invasive shrubs. So prescribed fire can be an effective tool at reducing the abundance of invasive species in the spring, and in particular, late spring fires. So after these plants have already started to green up or putting their green leaves on, because remember, they come out earlier than most of our natives. It seems to be, they seem to be more vulnerable at that time. So these late spring fires tend to be more effective at controlling invasive shrubs as opposed to early spring fires. And so here you can see a Bush honeysuckle that was actively already leafed out when the fire came through and it's wilted. Here's a stand of autumn olive that was burned. And if you get in there and look, the autumn olive stem on the top was burned and the autumn olive stem on the bottom wasn't. You can see clearly see the top one is very dead and the bottom one is still very green, right? So you won't kill them all. They'll certainly still be resprouting, but it seems to be a lot more effective at reducing that abundance at that time of year if you wait until kind of late spring. Other things for woody plants in the spring would be treating sprouts. So if you come in and you do a fall fire or a very early spring fire, if you're using mulching or cutting plants down in the fall or the winter, you're going to get sprouts coming up in the spring. And so when you do that, the one thing that you've got to be careful about is not treating those sprouts too early. There's not a lot of leaf area on those plants, on those when they're really just starting to sprout out, and you're not going to be able to get enough herbicide down into those root systems and be taken up by those leaves when the leaves are that small and just starting. So in general, you should wait until there's enough leaf area. Rule of thumb is, about 24 inches tall on sprouts or so before you want to spray them to get good control on them. If you spray them like you see in the picture there when they're just starting to come out, you'll certainly wilt them down, but it's probably not going to kill that root system. Again, this is important again for prescribed fire or mulching, things like that, where you're doing the mechanical damage to that plant, but you're not necessarily killing the root system. You would follow up with sprout treatments that next spring. But again, wait until they're a couple feet tall. Then you're going to have much more, much more success. And the last thing that you can do in the spring with shrubs, again, would be that survey and monitoring. Like I said earlier, they're highly visible in the springtime. It's either they're flowering like Callery pear, or in this picture, it's a princess tree. So you can easily identify them, or they have that early leaf phenology where they stand out. And so, for example, here is some bush honeysuckle, early spring. Nothing else is green out there, so it's highly identifiable at that time of year. Makes it very easy to survey and look for it. Callery pear, of course, is blooming in the springtime. Very easy to pick out and very easy to find new infestations of it when it's flowering. When it leaves out and everything leaves out, it kind of falls into the background and it's much harder to find. So with invasive shrubs, what to do? So in the springtime, that mechanical removal of smaller individuals by hand or the use of one of these pulling aids like a weed wrench. Those moist soil conditions that we get in springtime are pretty conducive for mechanical removal of those smaller individuals. Other things you can do is wait until that full leaf expansion, and then you can conduct foliar or cut stump treatments, or you can conduct basal bark treatments on thin bark species at pretty much any time. Conduct spring prescribed fires to reduce the abundance of many of these invasive shrubs, particularly late spring burns. And then you can survey and monitor for invasive shrubs, right? And trees, they're highly visible at that time of year. What not to do in the spring would be those foliar and cut stump treatments during that period between bud break and bud expansion and full leaf expansion. That period of time, they're not very effective. And things not to do would be treat sprouts too early, right? You want to wait until they're 24 inches tall or so to treat those. So the last category I have here before question answer would be some general springtime preparation work. What you can do in terms of your tools, checking your tools, checking your herbicides. And so we all know we have a bunch of tools for controlling invasive species, whether they're hand tools, gas-powered tools, battery-powered tools, sprayers. All of these things we have as you're moving into that spring and summer invasive species control period. It's a great time early spring to kind of go through and check your tools, make sure they're in good working order, make sure that there's anything you need to replace and kind of go through there. And so there's kind of a maintenance checklist, if you will, of things to evaluate in this springtime before you start really ramping up invasive species control efforts. So for your sprayers, check your seals, your gaskets, your hoses. Those tend to dry out over time and crack. So these were things that you'd want to check in the spring before you start using those. Check your nozzles. So if they weren't cleaned out properly, a lot of times they can get clogged up and then just not really work. Look for cracks in the tanks. Do a test spray, make sure that it pressurizes well. And then if you're using bigger sprayers, it's a great time to recalibrate your sprayer so you know how much you're actually putting out on the ground and that it's working. Um, these are things to do. And the big thing is don't do them like the day that you're going to use them to control invasive species, because it's guaranteed that you're going to have a gasket broke or a hose broke or something that you're going to have to replace. And you're going to have to stop your invasive species control efforts and go and do that work. So do this ahead of time before you need them. It's a great way just to make sure that you're ready to go. You definitely should have in the winter made sure that you weren't storing herbicide in your sprayers, that you cleaned them out, that you put water through them so that you're not going to have a chance for clogs and things. But just in case, evaluate that and check that. In terms of your, hand tools, check that your handles aren't broken or cracked. Make sure they're sharp. Make sure they're actively working in terms of loppers and things. Sometimes they can get jammed up or gummed up and they just don't open and close and they'll need to be oiled, things like that. Just evaluate those hand tools. If you're using chainsaws or other gas-powered tools, it's a good idea to start them and run them ahead of time to make sure that they're working. Check your fuel filters, check your spark plugs, check your spark arresters on your exhaust to make sure they're clean. You definitely shouldn't have stored your power tools with gas in them over the winter. But if you did, you probably want to get rid of that gas, clean it out, put fresh gas in it, or definitely check your gas oil mixes so they don't last that long. They don't have a lot of a long shelf life. So a lot of times you have to replace that. You want to evaluate your chains to see if they can last another season, or do you need to buy new chains if you've already sharpened them too much? Blades, whether they need to be sharpened or replaced. So just check all those things to make sure they work and in good working order. And then look at your herbicide stores. Are your herbicides still within date? Are they too old? They need to be thrown away? Or do you have enough herbicides to that year, or do you need to buy new ones? These are some simple things you can do kind of during the downtime of early spring before your really invasive species stuff starts ramping up. Again, it's always good to check that ahead of time. Here's an example. So this is the bottom of a chainsaw that I was using this spring. I got it out. I went, put it on the tailgate of my truck to fill it up with gas for the first time this spring, and already in the field, ready to do work. And the gas just ran right through it. And what I found is it had been dropped at some point, and the gas tank had cracked. And I didn't know that until, again, I was out in the field ready to use it, and it was completely unusable. So I had to kind of go back and change my plans around. And so doing an early spring evaluation and check of all our equipment would have caught this. I could have had it repaired much earlier and been ready to go instead of losing a day of work because of ineffective equipment. If you are somebody that's a site steward or a volunteer or a manager of areas that have boot brush stations at trails, spring is a great time. It's kind of right before the big busy season of hikers and things. It's a great time to clean out your boot brush stations, get the dirt out from underneath of them. You can see on the left there's some stiltgrass growing right in there with that boot brush. Replenish with gravel at the base. Often replace bristles at that time of year. Clean everything, check your signage, just make sure it's all ready to go. Springtime's a great time to do that. So then you're ready for this thing's ready to kind of meet the rush of people coming out and hiking going forward. So what to do and what not to do in the springtime in terms of dealing with these kind of preparation for invasive species. So in the springtime, you can certainly do this maintenance evaluation of tools, sprayers, herbicides, just as I mentioned, inspecting and evaluating your gas-powered tools, your two-cycle mixes, cleaning and sharpening hand tools, evaluating handles, whether they're broken, inspecting sprayers, checking for leaks, replacing parts. All these things are great to do in the springtime before things ramp up. What you don't want to do is wait until you need those tools before you look at them. The first time you pull that out of your garage or your storage shouldn't be the day you're going to use it, right? These broken or non-operable tools create downtime, missed opportunities for invasive species control, and it just causes a headache. So working ahead of time really helps you um, uh, be most efficient and effective. So in summary, there's a lot of work to do on invasive species in the springtime. Focus on these tasks that are best suited for springtime. Save some of the other stuff for later in the year, and just try to be as effective as you can. And then I always like to put in here, just don't do invasive species management in a silo. Incorporate it with the other management activities you're doing, and they're including your spring management activities. And I'll end here just with a quote from the Nature Conservancy's Global Invasive Species Initiative, where I really like this. We control these invasive species because they're harming the native plants and animals we care so much about protecting. So that's ultimately what it's about. And so I hope this was effective, and I hope it was, informative about some of the things I think you should be doing in the spring. I am happy to take any questions we might have.